When you picture ancient Egypt, what pops into your head? Pyramids, right? Pharaohs. And probably slaves. Just tons of people toiling away in the desert. But what if I told you that for most of its 3,000-year history, that image, well, it isn't the whole story. Today, we're going to dig into the complicated truth about what it meant to be unfree in the land of the pharaohs.
This idea of Egypt as the house of slavery is powerful. It's deep in our cultural DNA, It comes from stories we've heard our whole lives, like the Book of Exodus. It's a very clear-cut, dramatic image. But the actual historical evidence, well, it tells a much messier and, honestly, a way more fascinating story.
Okay, so here's the most important thing to get your head around. Our modern idea of slavery, especially chattel slavery, where a person is legally considered property, like a chair or cow, it just doesn't fit ancient Egypt. Instead of a person being a thing, what we find is this complex web of social and economic dependency. It wasn't always for life, it wasn't always passed down to your kids, and that sharp line we imagine between free and slave, it was incredibly blurry. It was always changing.
So let's tackle this myth head-on. Was Egypt really the house of slavery that we all think it was? To figure that out, we've got to look at what the Egyptians themselves actually wrote down.
And this is where it gets really interesting. The ancient Egyptians were obsessed with record-keeping. These people documented everything, every bag of grain, every tax payment, every offering to the gods. And yet, for an institution that was supposedly so central to their society, there's almost no clear single legal code for slavery. That's silence, right there. That's our first huge clue that what was going on was something totally different.
All right, let's jump in our time machine and head way back to the earliest periods, the Old and Middle Kingdoms. This is where we see that we're not really looking at one thing called slavery, but this whole spectrum of servitude.
The bedrock of the whole system, especially in the Old Kingdom, was something called corvée labor. Think of it like a universal draft, but for work. It was basically a tax that everybody paid with their time and effort. If you weren't an elite noble or priest, you owed the state work on its big projects, building temples, digging canals, and even dragging stones for the pyramids. But here's the key. It was an obligation you fulfilled, not a permanent identity.
And the Egyptians had different words for these different statuses, which is super telling. On one extreme, you've got the squar honks, literally bound for life. These were foreign prisoners of war, and this is the closest thing to our idea of a slave. But then you have these really flexible words like bak. A top government official could call himself the king's humble bak or servant, but it could also mean a regular domestic servant. And then there's hum, a general word for a laborer that gets used more and more over time to mean something like slave.
This is so cool. You can actually see the nuance in the hieroglyphs themselves. Look at the sign for bak, the servant. Sometimes it's written with a little image of a man with a yoke around his neck. And hum, the laborer, can be shown holding a club. They literally baked the idea of force right into their writing system. It's fascinating.
Then, as we move into the Middle Kingdom, something starts to shift. A new person appears in the records, the Ni-Dos, or the free commoner. Think about that. The very fact that they suddenly needed a word for a free person tells you that for the first time, they're starting to think of its opposite as a distinct category. Society's getting more complex, and that blurry line is starting to get just a little bit sharper.
Okay, now let's jump forward to the New Kingdom. This is the Egypt of empire, of Tutankhamun and Ramesses the Great. And this is the period where Egyptian society gets the closest to that myth we all carry in our heads.
See, with a massive empire came constant war, and constant war meant a massive, massive influx of foreign captives. These were the squawkans, the bound for life. And for the first time, we see large-scale slavery based on prisoners of war becoming absolutely essential to the Egyptian economy. They were working in the temples, on huge state projects, and in the homes of the wealthy.
And the Egyptians themselves were brutally direct about it. Just listen to this from a major official document. I brought back in great numbers those that my sword has spared, their hands tied behind their backs, branded and enslaved, tattooed with my name. Wow, there's no ambiguity there, is there? This was the cold, hard reality of building an empire.
But, and this is a huge but, even here at the absolute peak of this system, it is still not simple. The evidence is just wild. People in servitude had surprisingly complex lives. Sure, their owners could rent them out, but get this, they could also own their own property, their own land. They were often considered part of the family household. They had legal rights to go to court, and some could even get an education. They were never just things.
And now for the part that really shatters our modern ideas about this.
For many of these people, servitude was not a permanent dead end. The Egyptian system actually had recognized legal pathways to freedom, which is something you just don't see in a lot of other slave-owning societies.
So how could you become free? Well, there were a few ways we know about from the documents. An owner could legally adopt you, which often happened with children born to a servant in the household. Marrying a free person was another way out. You could also be given to a temple, purified for the service of a god, which basically freed you from your human owner. And finally, you could be officially declared a free citizen.
And this status had a specific legal name, Nem-Ha, a free citizen. When you see that word pop up in a legal papyrus, it's a huge deal. It meant you were no longer a Bak or a Ham. You were a full-fledged member of society, with all the rights that came with it. Which brings us to one of the most incredible documents to survive from the ancient world, the Adoption Papyrus. Here's the story. A wealthy, sterile woman legally adopts and frees the children that her husband had with one of her female servants. And to make damn sure that everyone respected their new free status, the contract ends with this absolutely mind-blowing curse. I mean, just listen. May a donkey copulate with him and a donkey with his wife, whoever it be that shall call any of them a servant. They were not messing around. Their freedom was so total, so absolute, that to even question it would bring down this unbelievable public humiliation.
Of course, a system this complex didn't stay the same. Nothing does for 3,000 years. As we move into the later periods of Egyptian history, after the Great Age of Empire, the whole system began to change yet again.
So let's just do a quick recap of this whole journey. We started in the Old Kingdom with the system of universal work tax, the corvée. Then the Middle Kingdom comes along and introduces the idea of a free commoner, drawing new social lines. The New Kingdom hits, and with its empire, you get this peak of large-scale foreign slavery. And finally, in the later periods, as the empire fades, so does the reliance on that kind of mass captive labor.
And that brings us right to the heart of it. The crucial takeaway is this. The reason the ancient Egyptians didn't have one single word for slave that covers everything is because there was no single experience of servitude. It was a fluid, ever-changing spectrum of dependency, obligation, and outright coercion that looked totally different depending on when and where you were over 3 millennia.
And that kind of leaves us with a big question, doesn't it? When we look at this ancient, incredibly nuanced system, where the lines between free and unfree were so blurry, so changeable, how does that force us to look at our own world? How does it challenge our own, sometimes very rigid ideas about what labor and power and real freedom actually mean?